Hey everyone, would you guys mind moving the mouse? It's kind of right here. Thanks, that bothers me. Hey everyone, my name's Mike. I am gonna talk today about blob futures actually, which is kind of slightly different than block futures, but I think you'll see the connections. And this is joint work, Julian and Francesco. So let's jump in. Quick roadmap. So we're gonna start by kind of describing blob services themselves. And I think this is important to ground the discussion and kind of like what do blobs actually provide to L2s? What do they provide to L2 users? And kind of this is a good mental model to help us think about what blobs actually mean for blob futures. And then I'll spend section 2 kind of going a roundabout way of justifying blob futures as an important thing to do. Sorry. This mic's cutting out a bit, but hopefully it's good. And the reason I'm kind of doing this whole justification is actually that I think blob futures solve this kind of fundamental issue that the Ethereum scaling roadmap is facing. And so that might be a good reason to do them. And then the third part, we'll actually be talking about blob futures as like what services they provide potentially and what services they augment in terms of the rollup. So that's kind of where we're going. And yeah, kind of starting very much at the beginning, I think it's useful to kind of ground our discussion in confirmation rules. And so I kind of loosely define a confirmation rule as some signal about a transaction. And that signal can mean a bunch of different things. So the kind of normal first confirmation rule you get for an Ethereum L1 transaction is on Etherscan, they'll tell you that this block is unfinalized and may be susceptible to reorgs, but that it is included in a block, right? So this is saying 6 minutes ago there was a block that included your transaction. That's great, but the block is not finalized. But so this is like the first confirmation rule you get. Of course, the much stronger confirmation rule is this idea of accountable safety, which is that the block is finalized and it will get reorged out only if 1/3 of the stake is slashable. This is kind of like the normal confirmation rule we think of in terms of finalization. But we also get confirmation rules from L2s, right? And so this is a picture from Basescan. We get the green check mark, and in particular it says this block, or this transaction was confirmed by the sequencer, right? So this is kind of the normal centralized sequencer model where I just send them a transaction and they give me the green check mark immediately. And for a lot of use cases, this confirmation rule is sufficient. And the kind of takeaway from this slide is that blobs really provide confirmation rules for L2 transactions. And the value of that confirmation rule depends largely on the sequencing paradigm that the L2 is actually using. So we'll kind of unpack that in this slide. So I'll go through 2 different sequencing models. The first is centralized sequencers. And this is kind of the dominant model with which people interact with L2s, which is kind of alluded to in the previous slide, but they send the L2 transaction to the sequencer and get that confirmation immediately. So I call that confirmation number 1. And you know, this, for all intents and purposes, is like the most important confirmation you get when you're sending an L2 transaction. Of course, this is not the end of the story. Normal Ethereum kind of L1 stuff has to happen. So the kind of normal path is the centralized sequencer includes the L2 transaction in an L1 blob. They send the blob to the public mempool. The Ethereum builders and proposers listen to the public mempool and end up constructing an L1 block, this red thing, with an L1 blob and the L2 transaction bundled in it. So sorry, it's a little small, but hopefully you can kind of get the point that the transaction flowed all the way from the user into an Ethereum block. And this is kind of the second confirmation that the L2 user gets, right? Now there's more confirmation rules they could get. They could get that the L1 block is finalized. That's kind of confirmation number 3, et cetera, et cetera. But the key takeaway is that for this model, the first confirmation is sufficient for most users. And there's not really that much urgency to land the blobs on the L1, right? Like these are unstructured, or like from the point of view of the sequencer, there's kind of no one competing with them to land the L2 sequence on chain, so they can kind of just batch and post them at their leisure. There's no urgency. Now, to kind of go on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a version of sequencing called total anarchy, which leads to very different style of blobs that are actually very, very impatient. So the kind of previous blobs I was describing were, I call them patient because they can kind of sit around in the mempool for a while, maybe 2 or 3 blocks before getting included. The total anarchy sequence rollups are very different. So under this version, you have an L2 user who sends the transaction actually to a Tycho specific mempool. I'm going to use Tycho because they're the ones that implemented this first. Now, searchers actually observe the Tycho mempool. And again, this is slightly different than before because previously we just sent the transaction directly to the sequencer, but now we're actually sending it to an L2 specific mempool. And these searchers are competing to land an L1 blob with the L2 transaction in it. And only then, once that blob has been included in a block, does the user get their first confirmation, right? So they don't get that original green check mark that they got before. They actually have to wait until the blob lands on chain before they know their transaction sequenced on the L2. And this is super different because the first confirmation comes from blob inclusion, and thus there's a immense amount of urgency to get that blob landed on chain, both from a user experience perspective, right? Like, I don't know where my transaction stands if it hasn't been confirmed, but also from the searcher's perspective, they're all competing to actually be the sequencer for the L2 and collect the revenue from doing that. So this is like a very different model of blobs. These are very impatient. And an important note here is that in this version, I have the searcher sending the blobs directly to the builder. And the reason for that is they wouldn't want to send it to the public mempool, because if they do, then the L2 transactions and the ordering of the L2 transactions can just get front-ran by another competing L2 sequencer. So this is kind of like the very far end of the most competitive, most likely to be private order flow, MEV carrying blob paradigm that we expect. So yeah, this is kind of like a long intro to say there's kind of these two models of blobs. We have the patient public mempool blobs, and we have the impatient private order flow blobs. And currently today, this Dune dashboard shows the relative distribution. This is saying that over time, the number of blob carrying transactions that are going through private channels is about 20%. It's hovering there now. It doesn't seem to be going up very much. And the actual share of blobs is about 7%. So the takeaway here is actually kind of unlike MEP carrying transactions on L1, I think we can expect that public order flow and public blobs are going to be a dominant paradigm moving forward too, because the centrally sequenced L2s are, for the time being, kind of the main consumers of blob space. So I kind of caveat that by saying we expect patient blobs to be content using the public mempool as long as it provides a relatively good inclusion service. And this is kind of intentionally vague. Maybe this means like when I send a blob to the public mempool, it gets included within 2 or 3 Ethereum blocks. But if I have to wait 10 blocks, then I might switch to private channels because I want to get like some better guarantee about speed of inclusion. And I'll also kind of foreshadow that I think the public mempool is good, and having blobs distributed mainly through the public mempool is probably better for both builders and for low resource testers. And I'll kind of talk about both of those groups as we move forward. I guess the reason here is that both builders and low resource testers, if they are using private blobs, have to use a smaller amount of time to disseminate and download those blob data and decide if the block is going to be considered valid. So that's kind of where we're going with some of this. Cool. So that's all kind of setting the stage for describing what I think is a pretty important problem in the Ethereum scaling roadmap, which is going to be introduced in PeerDAS, which is the subsequent hard fork, which will be coming down the line kind of later this year. So first, I'm going to talk about 2 things that have to happen when blobs kind of are moving around the network. And I'll separate them into blob gossip and blob validation. So kind of first, just to set the stage, the Ethereum nodes are running 2 different clients. There's the execution client and the consensus client. And importantly, these clients are talking to different P2P networks. They have different peers, and they can use either of those networks to source the blobs that they need to download. And the blob mempool, which I'll kind of sometimes use the blob pool description for, is an execution layer object that maintains the set of pending but not included blob transactions. So this is exactly the same as the normal mempool, but just with the specific subset of transactions that are carrying blobs. And the important thing from the consensus layer is block validating and attesting. So when it's time to decide if a block is valid and vote on it, like send the attestation that says, I believe this block should be the head of the chain, the consensus layer has to kick in and check for the availability of blob data. So there's kind of like the blob pool that has the set of pending transactions, and then the actual validation and consensus operation that happens once the block has been published. So these are kind of like two very different paths that blobs can flow through. And the way this works today, I kind of tried to diagram here, And we have 2 slots. The block is published sometime after the beginning of slot n+1. And importantly, these green blobs, which I'm calling these public blobs, can kind of arrive at any point during the previous slot. And the reason they can arrive then is because they're not worried about kind of getting included right in time. They have this patient property. And these blobs are largely going to come through the public mempool. So I'm calling these like the execution layer blobs that arrive, and they're amortized over the whole previous slot, potentially. Now, during slot n+1, the block has been built, and let's say there's 2 private blobs that have not been in the mempool that have to get gossiped in time for the attestation deadline, which is 4 seconds into this slot. So now we're in this situation where the attester who's like deciding whether or not this block is valid has 4 blobs that they downloaded earlier and 2 blobs that they have to download kind of just in time or right before the attestation deadline. And a really important thing here is that blob pool blobs, so these green blobs, can be used for block validation, right? So if this block includes 6 blobs, the 4 green ones and the 2 purple ones, then they don't have to re-download the 4 green ones when they're doing block validation because they already got those from the execution layer. So like there's this nice synergy between the execution layer and the consensus layer. And the consensus layer can ask the execution layer, hey, have you seen these blobs? Because I need them to validate my block. The EL will say, yes, I've seen 4 of them, but you have to go download the other 2. And that's kind of how the processing happens. And importantly, there's this fundamental symmetry, which is the types of these 2 processes are the same. Namely, they're the full blob, right? So under EIP 4844, the block validation rule says that the full blob has to be available. You have to download all 6 of the blobs to ensure that you can like claim that the block is valid. And because the execution layer gossips full blobs, you can already use those and like pipeline them straight into the block validation flow. And I guess this is the symmetry that breaks with PeerDAS. So what is PeerDAS? Quick reminder, this is an EIP that's slated to be the headline for the headlining EIP of the Fusaka hard fork, which will probably happen around October of this year. And it allows massive scaling of the blob count by reducing the DA checks to a subset of the columns of each blob, right? So as I was saying before, currently the DA check says, are all 6 blobs available in full, right? I download the entire 128 KB object, and for every blob that's referenced in the block, I have to see the entire contents. With PeerDAS, we're actually moving to a column-based sharding. So this is today. We have kind of the target. I guess we switched to 6.9. But anyway, they download all of the columns for all of the blobs. In PeerDAS, you kind of are assigned a random subsample of the columns. Maybe you get columns 3, 8, and 12 or whatever, and you just download those columns. And the important thing is you can kind of scale the number of blobs because you're only downloading a portion of each blob. So you keep the bandwidth requirements the same, but you can like massively increase the number of blobs and the throughput of the chain in aggregate. So now, how does this look on our block validation and gossip flow? So things are slightly different now. In particular, the green blobs are still the public mempool blobs. These are the patient blobs that we expect to kind of continue flowing through public channels. And again, we have the private blobs as these like purple slices. But now the private blobs are only specific columns of the full blob that's referenced by the block. So basically what happens here is at the beginning of the slot, the attesters will receive a block, and then they'll see that some of the blobs in the block they haven't seen because they're private, and they have to go fetch the columns of the blobs that they haven't seen. Now, the difference here is from the fact that the types of these 2 operations are now no longer the same because the blob pool still contains full blob objects, whereas the block validation flow only contains column data. And this is weird because we're saying, oh, we're massively increasing the throughput of the chain by reducing the bandwidth needed while increasing the number of blobs. But actually, to stay connected to the mempool, you have to download all of these blobs. And so we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit because we're saying, oh, we're scaling, but to stay connected to the mempool, you still have to download all the blobs. So that's this like fundamental tension. And so yeah, the kind of key takeaway is that without changing anything, the blob bandwidth increases by 8x if you 8x the number of blobs, while the DA check remains constant. So this is kind of where we stand, and yeah, that's something that I think is worth evaluating. So kind of zooming back out, there's a few things to highlight. First and foremost, no protocol enshrined changes will be implemented in the blob pool in Fusaka. So the Fusaka hard fork is like set in stone. The EIPs are fixed and PeerDAS is going in, but nothing that solves this asymmetry thing I was just describing is gonna go in. So we're gonna at least have one hard fork with this asymmetry. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, I mentioned protocol enshrined specifically because there's non-protocol enshrined versions that could be used to address this. For example, if you're a low resource node, you could just say, I'm actually gonna just hard cap my bandwidth of the blob mempool and I'm only gonna download 10 blobs per slot. And maybe that's fine. Obviously this is like a local node decision that you have to make based on your bandwidth. But these are kind of band-aid things and harder to reason about than a protocol enshrined change. Secondly, the number of validators self-building is so low that the blob inclusion service might not significantly degrade. So let's say there's only 5% of blocks that are being self-built. In that world, even if those self-building blocks don't include all 48 blobs that they should have been listening to in the mempool, maybe it doesn't matter because 95% of the time, the builders are building the block and they're able to download the full blobs. They have a full view of the mempool. They're like dealing with the gossip and dissemination increase gracefully. So maybe that's fine. And kind of the last fact I want to highlight is that shifting to a private blob regime is not inevitable because public blobs, I think, are better for builders. And the main claim here is that public blob is better for builders because builders can be confident that a blob that they include in their block, if it is public, has already been downloaded by most of the network. So they don't take on the risk of saying, do I have to decide to include this blob or not, if I know that the network has probably already seen the blob and I'm not gonna get my block reorged out by having to gossip a bunch of blobs kind of just in time. So for that reason, I think it's actually better for builders. And my first claim here is that it's worth keeping the public blob pool to amortize the blob bandwidth consumption for low resource testers. So the first, or fact number 3 is kind of talking about builders. For low resource testers, I think it's also important that all 48 blobs, even though they have to do only the columnar data of the data sampling, we probably don't want all of those columns to have to be downloaded just in time. Like it's probably better for low resource testers to have kind of a steady stream of blobs coming in through the previous slot, and then the few private blobs that do land in the block to just download those specific columns. Like that's probably a cleaner model of how low resource testers can get good guarantees about low bandwidth. And kind of looking forward, solving this fundamental asymmetry seems important to continue scaling, right? So PeerDAS kind of goes this 1D sharding direction. Obviously, going to the full DAS sharding involves 2D sampling, and if we increase the number of blobs by another order of magnitude, then you still have the same issue of like, oh, to connect to the blob pool, you now have 100x more bandwidth needed than you have today. So it does feel like something that is kind of needed to be addressed if we want the DA scaling roadmap to kind of make sense. Cool. Just gonna do a quick time check. Okay, yeah, I'm good. Right, so you might be thinking, why don't we just simply shard the blob pool, right? Like this is a natural thing. The claim is that the consensus layer, like the attesters need to download only some columns of each blob. Is it simple as just saying, okay, when you gossip a blob to the blob pool, only send a single column of the blob like to a specific peers based on what that peer actually needs to do their attestation? And the simple answer is no, because this is a free DOS vector on the blob pool. So one really nice thing about the existing mempool today is that I only gossip a transaction if it's valid and fee paying. So in some sense, there's kind of like economic value that has to be kind of burned, the opportunity cost of like having a transaction that's valid and fee paying in order to get write access to the mempool. Versus there's no way to prove that a column belongs to a fee paying transaction without actually seeing the full blob transaction itself. So the kind of naive thing of just taking the blob and splitting it up into columns just doesn't work because people can then send arbitrary bytes throughout the blob pool. And the takeaway is that we need to ensure that the column data pays somehow for the service that they're consuming, or pays for the resources of the bandwidth that they're using. And that brings us to blob futures. So 19 minutes into the talk, and now I say futures for the first time, so thanks for bearing with me. And this is this is where the talk kind of turns into very forward-looking, speculative, but the point being, you could consider a blob futures auction as a way to solve this problem that we described, this asymmetry between the execution layer and the consensus layer. And the simple one-liner is that you just auction the blob space off in advance, and you only allow gossip of pre-allocated blobs. So if you sell a blob future, and Kubi buys it, then when slot n hits and he's trying to gossip his blob, he can shard it and gossip it, and each shard now comes with a signature that it is accompanying a blob future that was purchased. So now we've solved this DOS problem because Kubi paid for the blob future, and we know that no one can arbitrarily write bytes to the blob pool. Yeah, I guess there's a very short sketch of how this could work. You could have slot n-2 bids for the slot n blobs. In the subsequent slot n-1, the bids can be processed, and in slot n, the blob columns are gossiped. So this is a very simple version of this where you could actually do the auction on chain. Of course, there's huge design space here. Obviously, this is a slight caveat that's saying this is a full redesign of the blob inclusion pipeline. This replaces the blob base fee. This replaces the blob priority fee. It's possible that maybe only a subset of blobs should be sold kind of ex ante, and then the remaining blobs use the existing fee mechanism. The design space here is very large. But I think it's kind of worth exploring what blob futures mean if it also solves this engineering technology problem of how do you scale the blobs on the blob pool. So now I want to walk through two different user journeys, if you will, about what blobs can offer to L2s and L2 users. And in particular, showing kind of the contrast between if you don't have blob futures, what the rollups have to do, versus if you did have blob futures, what the rollups could do. Because I think it's kind of an interesting way to understand what blob futures can offer. So we have kind of three people here. We have Alice, we have ZK rollup, and the L1. And let's say Alice wants to trustlessly bridge her ETH from the L2 to the L1. So this is a kind of classic problem in rollup design because bridging into the rollup is super easy, right? You send ETH from an EOA to the bridge, and you get your L2 ETH immediately. But to withdraw your ETH out is much harder. This is what you have to wait the 2-week challenge period for on optimistic rollups. You have to wait for the ZK proof to be posted before you can withdraw your ETH. So that's kind of a good thing that if blob futures can solve this, that's a pretty cool unlock, I think. So the kind of key takeaway here is that the ZK rollup, you can think of this as kind of the sequencer. So Alice sends a transaction that signals her intent to withdraw her ETH from the L2. The sequencer needs to post a blob with Alice's transaction and a proof that her transaction has been included, that the L2 state transition is valid, before the L1 can actually process Alice's L1 ETH and send it to her. Now, there's uncertainty around when the next blob post happens because the ZK, there's no kind of blob space futures market right now, right? So the rollup is in this world where they want to kind of give good service to their users, but they can't guarantee timely blob inclusion at all. There could be a builder that buys the next 10 blocks and decides to censor the rollup, and there's kind of nothing they can do. They could include 0 blobs for the next 10 slots, and there's nothing that the rollup can do. And kind of on Alice's end, she can't hold the rollup accountable. The rollup can't make any credible commitment to her that it'll do something in time because she has no kind of credible threat of conflict resolution if the rollup doesn't do that. So now let's examine the same case study but with blob futures, right? So now we have the same three people. The ZK rollup's able to kind of ex ante buy a blob future. And maybe they buy one per slot, one per every other slot or whatever. Let's assume that blobs are relatively abundant. Then when Alice sends her request to withdraw her L2 ETH, the rollup can actually do a few things. First, it can respond with a credible commitment. And it can say, I have a signature over my blob future that says, my blob future is valid for slot n. I guarantee you that by slot n, there will be a blob transaction that includes your withdrawal request. And second, they have certainty around when their next blob is able to be posted because they have a blob future. The attesting committee has some strong guarantee where if a blob gets gossiped in time and is accompanied with a valid blob future, then it must be included. Like you could imagine like a fossil version of transaction forced inclusion, but with these blob futures. And now the L1 can immediately send Alice the ETH. And importantly, Alice also can potentially do some sort of dispute resolution, some sort of slashing, if the commitment isn't honored. So there's kind of two things here. The rollup can guarantee this timely inclusion, and Alice now has some accountability over the guarantee that the rollup gave her. And like both Alice can hold the rollup accountable, and the rollup can actually give a credible commitment to being able to process the withdrawal. So this is kind of like two improvements, I would say, that blob futures offer in terms of the L2 to L1 bridging story. Okay, one more user journey is pre-conf rollup interop. So I know there's a lot of like based pre-conf sequencers in here, so hopefully this resonates. But the kind of first thing I'll describe is without blob futures again. So without blob futures, we have the situation where rollup A and rollup B are delegating their sequencing to the L1 proposer. So this is kind of the normal based version where you say, okay, the L1 proposer has opted in to being the sequencer for these two rollups. And that's great because now Alice can send a transaction on rollup A to the L1 proposer, get a pre-conf, and send a transaction on rollup B and get a pre-conf from the same proposer. Like this is kind of how people are pitching pre-confs largely. And this is great because maybe Alice can do a cross-chain ARB atomically and quickly. But there's a few problems with this. First, all based rollups are sequenced by the same person, which is the L1 proposer. Now maybe this is fine because there's economies of scale and you need like lots of cross-chain kind of atomic interop to create the most value. But the reality is that L1 proposer has like immense power, immense market power, kind of like monopoly power over selling those pre-confs during their slot. And secondly, base sequencing competes with L1 execution, right? So imagine you're someone who wants to be an L2 builder and you just only want to sequence all these based rollups, but you don't want to deal with the L1 MEV competition, you don't want to do the sexdex ARB, et cetera. Right now, there's not really a way for you to do that other than by kind of submitting blobs to the builder and hoping that the builder includes them. You have like kind of not very strong guarantees, and there's no way for you to, unless you compete in the L1 builder auction directly, there's no way for you to guarantee that your blob gets included at a given slot. So this kind of competitive pressure is potentially bad because it doesn't allow specialization of roles. Like you can't be an L2 specific sequencer probably, like that role probably gets bundled into being the L1 proposer. With blob futures, there's potentially a world where this is kind of more flexible and better. So again, we have two rollups, they're delegating their sequencing, but now they're delegating their sequencing to the L1 blobs, and the L1 blobs are being sold as blob futures. So they're being sold a priori. And now you have L2 searchers who are competing. You have a competitive marketplace of people trying to buy this blob future ahead of time. And someone's going to win. Someone's going to be the person who has the blob future. Once they have the blob future, then you can have the same pre-conf story for two different rollups from the blob future holder. So yeah, there's kind of two pieces of this. First, the L2 searchers are now able to compete to buy blob futures to sequence these based rollups. And base sequencing doesn't compete with L1 execution anymore because you've kind of like segmented the blob space off from the block space, and you said, okay, we have this normal L1 block space auction, which is extremely competitive, and like there's large economies of scale here. But if you want to be a base sequencer, potentially you're able to compete and kind of specialize in that role, and do so by purchasing blob futures rather than competing in the PBS auction today. So yeah, that was a lot. Quick TLDR, PeerDAS introduces this fundamental asymmetry between how blobs are gossiped and validated. Blob futures are a market-based mechanism to eliminate this asymmetry and allow us to gossip just the columns and kind of type check between the execution layer and the consensus layer. And the set of features that blob futures offer, rollups, is part of the design considerations. I think historically when we talk about these MEV auctions, we usually think about them from like an infrastructure side. But hopefully these user journeys kind of help us think about how the L2 user and L2 rollup kind of UX plays into how we're thinking about protocol changes. So yeah, thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Appreciate your attention. Yeah, Drew.
Do you think blob futures will be implemented out of protocol or in protocol?
I guess if I had to bet, I would bet out first, because generally if there's like market demand for something, it's going to happen faster out of the protocol than in. Yeah, maybe there's blob boost or something like that.
Yeah, or through commit boost. But the other question I had is you talked about the ability for validators to communicate a certain constraint on their data availability, essentially, like, or what they can ingest and propagate. Do you think that that will happen in the client? Like, will clients implement like a flag that says similar to like the gas fee, or will it be through some other mechanisms that they'll have to broadcast, or it doesn't matter? Like, do people need to know ahead of time that, hey, I can only handle 10 blobs?
I see, right. Yeah, I guess my intuition here is that that would be a local decision that's not broadcast. It's just like, you know, my view of the mempool is just the 10 first blobs that I heard, and everyone's view in that case would be quite fragmented, because if there's 40 blobs and everyone only has 10, then everyone's view of which 10 arrived first is going to be very different. Obviously, if this ended up in a world where the rate limiting of the mempool actually caused like a reduction in blob throughput on mainnet, then I think the more likely outcome is that the blobs just flow directly to builders, rather than trying to like have this per validator data transmitted. Again, I don't think the only equilibrium is to flow through private order flow, because I do think the public nature of the blobs is like means they're like uniquely able to go through the mempool. So I don't think that's like a necessary, or like that's not a guaranteed outcome. But yeah, I think if the blob inclusion service did degrade meaningfully, that would be the natural way for things to move. Hey, Barnaby.
Hi. In the interrupt thing, yeah, that one. Do you worry that L2 sorry, that's not working. Do you worry that the L2 searchers will have to basically centralize? Like, for instance, it would be hard for me to get a precount from one searcher and then a precount from another searcher. Like, it would make sense for a large by blobs, no?
Yeah. So one slide that I actually took out of this talk, because I thought it was maybe too in the weeds, was kind of comparing my mic went out too. Comparing our old kind of Blockspace future designs with Blobspace futures. And I guess one of the main concerns that we ended up with Blockspace futures is this idea that it's very centralizing, because whoever is able to buy and resell Blobspace futures most effectively is kind of gonna serve as the intermediary, the broker between the actual like people who demand Blockspace and the people who can sell it. And then multi-slot MEV, I guess the issue being, if you can sell multiple blocks in a row, then the danger there is that it creates this kind of new form of toxic MEV where you censor many blocks in a row and then do a big arb on the last block. So I do think the same types of concerns are probably there with blob futures too. But I guess maybe the claim of blob futures is that separating that, at least from the L1 validator economics, is potentially good. And just like maybe you have consolidation of the based sequencers, but it's a different consolidation than the consolidation of the L1 builders, and it's also a different constituency than the L1 proposers or the L1 attesters. So maybe it's like a separation of powers thing, but yeah, I agree with you that it's a valid question.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool, thanks. It's Mike Neuder, MikeNeuder, and that's my Telegram and Twitter. Yeah, should be easy to find. All right, thank you very much.